Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 2022 horror film, Men. Now, I know this film has a fair amount of fans. I know it got a lot of good reviews from critics when it came out last year in 2022, but I really don't care for this film. I'm going to be honest. I don't think that this movie is a total, complete, and utter disaster. I don't think it's completely without merit, but I definitely feel that it's absolutely nowhere close to a masterpiece of horror, or just a masterpiece of film in general. And I really do feel that for the most part, it's nowhere near as clever, nowhere near as innovative, or as complex of a film as a lot of people are making it out to be. And on top of that, I think it's a very dull, very boring, sluggish film in a lot of different ways. I think a lot of it ties down to how lazy the narrative is, how lazy the complexity of the script is, and it's just one of those movies that when you see the title and you understand the current landscape that we're in politically, it's exactly what you think it is going to be. And that's disappointing, because the more interesting thing would be to steer things into a different direction, to come at things from a different perspective than the one that we've already seen, and the one that's already been beaten over our heads or shoved down our throats for the past few years or so. Now, the film is written and directed by Alex Garland. And Alex Garland, to me, he's a talented filmmaker, but he's in a similar boat as Ari Aster, where he's a great filmmaker. He's a really good director. He does a great job with the lens. He does a really spectacular job working with different angles and camera techniques and employing them in just really just visually stunning and just brilliant ways. He's a great filmmaker. His films look fantastic. His films look amazing. And I do feel that he's incredibly talented in that particular regard from a technical standpoint when it comes to being behind the camera and shooting scenes and shooting settings and doing all of this and collaborating with a cinematographer. But I don't feel he's nearly as good of a writer as a lot of people make him out to be. And on top of that, I don't think he really is the best when it comes to getting consistently good performances out of his cast either, especially consistently authentic performances. And I don't know what it is with these A24 horror films. So many of them, they're not only just pretentious, but they're dull. They're boring, despite potentially interesting and intriguing conversations and complexities when it comes to the narratives. They lack a deep emotional connection at the core of them, which makes the attempts at horror, the attempts at suspense, the attempts at intrigue fall flat. And Men is another one of those films. I will say I would rather watch Men again over Midsommar or Hereditary or The Witch, because those films are honestly even more pretentious than this film is, and they're even harder to watch, and they have even less going for them to me personally. Also, those films are twice as long. Like, this is still a fairly lengthy film, but it's only 100 minutes. It's not 120 or 140. It doesn't feel like it's 3 or 4 hours long. It suffers from similar issues when it comes to the way that the narrative is presented, but I would admit this is more of an A24 horror film that I could technically tolerate in comparison to those other ones. But I still don't feel it's a thrilling horror masterpiece, or, you know, it's some kind of just new horror classic for the ages. Absolutely not. And a big part of it is the script. Now, Alex Garland, like I said numerous times already in this video, he's a very talented and just tremendous director. Does a great job with the camera and with direction and with technical elements of a production. I don't think he's nearly as terrific of a writer. And I felt that way about Ex Machina. I felt that way about Annihilation. I felt that way about pretty much almost anything he's written, with a few exceptions. And I think Garland, he can write a narrative that has an idea or a concept that shows potential, but he just isn't capable, at least to me personally, of making that script live up to the full potential of that concept or the ideas that are presented within it. And Men is a prime example of that. To me, this script is just one massive missed opportunity, because in today's political and societal and cultural climate, there is this just ongoing onslaught against men from a certain subsect or portion of society who have this belief that all men are misogynist, all men are the same, and they are the problem. All men perpetuate this cycle of abuse or misogyny or sexism, and this film just further solidifies that flawed argument. And it does it in a way that is incredibly lazy and nowhere near as clever as some people make it out to be. I'm sorry, having a film called Men, where you have this entity or demon who takes the form of all these different men who represent different lecherous, despicable, or disgusting qualities of men in society, is not anything that is really that unpredictable, let alone that unique, because it's stuff that we've already seen, we've already heard before numerous times already in other films that deal with men. Like, let's look at Promising Young Woman, for instance. Almost every man in that film was just a variation of a misogynist, a abuser, a sexist, so on and so forth, with very little variation. But this film, it does that, but in a way that just makes it even more comical, even more silly, even more hard to take seriously. I don't take this demon taking all these different forms as seriously as I think that the writer intended, because of the execution of everything. When you see that there's this other entity that is just a naked guy with twigs and leaves growing out of his face and his twigs and berries showing, it's hard to take that seriously, regardless of whether it's based or rooted in mythology or anything. It's incredibly difficult to take seriously. It's like the original version of the short story of The Lawnmower Man by Stephen King, where there's a scene where a guy has grass pubes and he's running around naked. That's ridiculous. And the same thing occurs here with this script, with the Green Man and the way that it's presented and the way that you see it in the film. And this script also is lazy in the way that it handles this discussion of toxic masculinity, because it doesn't say anything new. It just reiterates the same arguments, the same tired arguments you've already heard a million times over, and doesn't do it in that creative of a fashion either. And you could have done so much more with it. You could have mentioned and had this discussion about toxic masculinity and the damage that it does to society, but you could have also talked about the other side of things. You could have talked about toxic femininity and how that is destructive in its own way. You could have shown the relationship between Harper and her husband, her late husband, James, in a more complex and intriguing and realistic fashion by showing both sides to the relationship. Not just showing a one-sided take on it from Harper's perspective, showing it from both sides, showing that both of them have their own flaws and their own issues with their ideologies, and how that clashes, and how that can lead to other instances in their lives that lead to tragedy. I think there would have been an interesting discussion to have if this film shifted in a way where you think at first that all of these men are the same, but then you find out that it's really her grief that's being personified in this way. It's her guilt for maybe having something to do with what happened to her husband and what's happened with her relationships with other men that's causing her to see these men as the same. And then there's another man who comes into the fray later on who actually is legitimately a good man, because contrary to what some people think, good men exist in this world. Not all men are complicit or a part of some conspiracy against women. Not all men are misogynists. Not all men are sexist. Not all men are pricks. That's the reality. It's like the same thing for women. I don't buy the mindset that a lot of incels have about women, that they're all the same and they hate men, or they don't like this, or they're like this. Like, I don't buy that either. I think equally, when it comes to how just absurd and asinine these beliefs are from both men and women when it comes to this particular kind of thing. I think it's absolutely absurd on both sides. So why not use this film as a platform to discuss the absurdities and the craziness of both of these sides of the coin, instead of just showing the same side we've already seen before? You show a man who's actually a good guy and comes in and later on in the film and actually helps Harper get over what she's dealing with and helps her defeat the entity. Because maybe you can tie it into where the entity and the demon, it's preying upon her insecurities. It's preying on her guilt. It's doing all of these things. And it seems like that's what this film does at times, but it does it in such just a blasé, bland, and banal way. And it's disappointing because you have a platform to create a complex and interesting discussion about how men and women view each other in society and how destructive those views can be on an equal front. But no, instead we get an unequal discussion, the same and equal discussion that we've had way too many times in a lot of modern media, and it's a bummer. It's a shame. It really is. I would agree with some of the claims about it being some kind of new masterwork if it had that discussion. But it didn't. It just had the same discussion we've seen a million times. And even the subtext is just very typical when it comes to this kind of slant. You got like apples, like Adam and Eve. You got all this imagery that is pretty tired at this point and rote when it comes to sexism and misogyny in mythology and throughout history. You've got the scene that's supposed to be some kind of crazy twist at the end, where the man who gives birth to a bunch of different men, which it steals and takes away the woman's uniqueness in terms of how she's able to give birth. And I'm like, that's kind of sexist in its own way, that you think that the one thing that differentiates a man from a woman in a lot of different ways is the fact that the woman can give birth to a new life. And if a man takes that away, then that's like the biggest horror and the scariest thing, because then the men have taken away everything else, and then they take away that. And I'm like, that's kind of sexist, because you think that a woman just boils down to her reproductive organs or her reproductive ability. And yeah, I agree with other critics who have pointed that out, and how much of a fallacy and how just damaging that is. And then you get to like the ending, and it's a twist that you see a million years away, like a million miles away. I mean, I saw it coming like halfway through the film. I was like, okay, this husband character is going to show up again in some way or shape or form, right? And then you get to the birthing scene. I'm like, the last birth is going to be the husband, right? And it is. And even that doesn't lead to anything. It's not a satisfying conclusion because it's another just lazy bit of writing where Garland just leaves it up to interpretation in the laziest way imaginable. And it just makes the entire film kind of pointless because you have this whole build up to her facing her guilt and facing her dead husband and how he made her feel guilty for all this time after he killed himself, because he was doing this whole thing where he was gaslighting her even before he killed himself. And now he's still gaslighting her from beyond the grave, and she's able to stand up to him like she stood up to the entity, the demon, and cut him up earlier. And showed that she was strong and independent. And then here she faces off against her dead husband, and you don't see anything. You see nothing. There's no conclusion to anything. There's nothing satisfying. She doesn't stab him. She doesn't do shit. She just walks out of the house and sees her friend and smiles. And then the movie ends. And then you're like, what? So you have all this bizarre imagery. You have all this surreal stuff. You have these scenes where you have this one man who's playing different versions of different misogynistic, sexist men, and they're beating you over the head with that, coupled with all this just subtext and all this other stuff that's thrown into the narrative, and it fails to make you sympathize with the lead, Harper, as much as I really feel it should have. It doesn't show both sides of the relationship between her and her dead husband. Even the husband's suicide is handled in a way that's laughable and just over the top. And that's another problem. It's just so much of the script is just so over the top and so overdone and just absolutely ludicrous. It really is. And it could have been something interesting. Could have been something complex and create some really genuinely fascinating conversations about different aspects of society. But it just opens up the same discussion that we've already heard time and time again in a very lazy fashion and a very unsatisfying fashion. Because there's nothing satisfying about the end of the film. And it's not really that scary or that horrifying or that tense, despite there being some moments. Like when you didn't quite know what was going on. It was surreal. It was weird. It was unsettling in its own way. There were some creepy scenes of the Green Man or other people just creeping around the property. There was an effective sequence where Harper fends off and fights the demon and cuts his hand lengthwise, and what was actually a pretty good effect. And speaking of effects, it does have some good practical effects and gore, but that doesn't mean that it's a great film or a masterpiece just because those are present, especially when the script is so subpar. And you have a very limited group of characters, but like, other than Harper, who is still pretty one-dimensional in all honesty, you don't really have anyone to really connect with that much. You don't connect with the guy who is like the homeowner, or the guy who rents the house, and he's supposed to be like one of the few men in the film that isn't a total piece of shit. But I still don't think that Garland handled that well either. And her friend that she's communicating with via the phone or the computer, who only shows up in person, I think, near the end of the movie. And other than that, like, what else do you have? Like her husband in the flashbacks before he killed himself, or afterwards when he resurrected himself out of the Green Man. Oh, did Rory Kinnear and all his different versions of himself that felt like you were watching a comedy from the BBC. Like, even the way that Harper is written, like I said, you're not very sympathetic towards her, and she just feels very. She's written in a way where she doesn't feel like a human being. Like she's just a cardboard cutout and personification of grief and angst and anger for what her dead husband put her through and what men put her through. And there are other times where the way that she's written is childish, like the way that she reacts to things. It's like a child would. She's reacting to echoes in a tunnel like she's 5 years old. Oh my God, an echo. This is so amazing. I've never heard an echo before in a tunnel. Like, really? Are you kidding me? And then when you have stuff where she sees things that no person has ever seen before in their life, where a man has given birth to multiple men in bloody fashion, she reacts to it like she just saw a bit of moldy cheese in the refrigerator. You're like, what? And honestly, I blame Alex Garland for that too, because he's the director. He's probably the one that told her to act like that. I know I repeated that, but it bears repeating. Because it's just something that I can't even wrap my head around, that any director would be like, yeah, that take was great. That's the perfect way to react to a sequence of events like that. But yeah, the script, just beyond subpar. And it's a shame, because you do have some talented people in the cast. Like, Jessie Buckley is a talented actress. She's a good actress. Wouldn't really know it from her performance here as Harper, other than a few moments where she shows emotion. A lot of the time, her performance is just uneven. It's all over the place. She's acting in unnatural ways, and the performance comes across as either forced or there's not enough there. It's like it's either forced and over the top, or it's underdone. Like, it's either overdone or it's underdone when it comes to the performance. Rory Kinnear's Jeffrey and all the other different versions and numerous men. Like, I couldn't take this character seriously with the accents and all this other stuff and the way that he played these characters. It played out like a comedy to me. It wasn't scary. It wasn't intimidating. It wasn't believable. I really did feel like I was watching a BBC comedy. I really did. Like a one-man show with this one guy playing all these different characters with fake teeth and wigs and all in different accents. I half expected a laugh track half the time. Papa Essiedu is James Marlowe. Literally nothing. Nothing performance. All he was there is to be a typical misogynistic asshole character who is gaslighting his wife. And I guess he did a good job with that, but I didn't buy it. It felt just as forced as some of the overacting from Jessie Buckley or Rory Kinnear. I guess the most authentic performance is by Gayle Rankin as Riley, because she barely has any screen time. Or Frida, the friendly police officer, who has like a very small role in the film. And yeah, from a technical standpoint, the film is tremendous. So the cinematography by Rob Hardy is some of the most gorgeous, beautiful cinematography I honestly have seen from 2022. I just wish it was in a lot better movie. The editing by Jake Roberts, not so bad that I want to, take a DDT from Jake the Snake, but it still wasn't anything spectacular or stupendous by any means. The music by Ben Salisbury and Geoff Barrow, forgettable. Another instance of music just being there for mood and atmosphere and not being anything remotely memorable or anything that you connect with on a deeper level or want to listen to again on its own. I'm sorry, the echo shit doesn't do it for me. I never thought it was really that creepy or that effective. I felt it was just another instance of just ridiculousness in this already silly, ridiculous movie where you have a man giving birth to other men, and you got this green man with twigs and leaves growing out of his face and out of his ass and out of his ball sack. And then you have like, oh, 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 oh. And I'm like, what? What is this? It's like, why do they think that the sounds of some woman fingering herself is so terrifying when it comes to these A24 films? They did this shit in Midsummer in one scene, and they did it again here, and they're doing it in in a trailer for a new A24 horror film that's coming out later. And I'm like, why do they think this is such an amazing thing? Like, I don't get it. It's not scary, it's not unsettling, it's silly. And yeah, the 100-minute running time also drags because I just can't get into the story. I can't get into the story of the characters because it's so one note, it's so one dimensional, it's so paper thin. It's just a whole bunch of, oh hey, this woman got emotionally berated and gaslit by her husband who's now dead, and then she goes on this retreat to this cottage somewhere to try to unwind, and then she comes in contact with this demon who's a representation of the worst aspects of men in society, and then ultimately she comes face to face with her ex-husband, literally from beyond the grave, and then it's over because there really isn't much of any sort of actual conflict. You build a conflict here with, oh, she's dealing with the grief and the loss and all of this with her husband and his suicide. But then you get to the end of the movie, and then there's no resolution to it. So, and there was barely a conflict to begin with. So you're like, what was the conflict for one, other than her facing misogynists and sexists and just dealing with the depravity and the disgusting nature of all men? What was that? What was the conflict? That would seem like that was the only conflict. Because then once she fights the entity and fights him off and then confronts her husband, like what? That was all it was? It was just a way for her to just come to the realization that she's on her own and she doesn't need no men, and all men are bad. Is that really what the whole impetus behind the conflict was? The resolution to the conflict is just her to realize that she's an independent woman and she don't need no man? Really? So yeah, it's just a weak film. It really is. Despite its subject matter, despite what it's trying to say, it's a weak film with a weak narrative and a weak script. And really, what it did need, it needed a strong male character as well as a strong female character coupled together to make it feel like it means more. It needed both. It needed the duality of male and female, and it didn't need to be so one-sided in order for it to actually feel like it's something unique or genuinely intriguing instead of just yesterday's news or yesterday's tweets. But anyway, that's my thoughts on Men, and until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.